Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to WAVE's webinar session. My name is Lena Piskernik, Step Up Campaign Assistant in the WAVE office in Vienna. I will be assisting today with the technical aspects, while Kerstin Schinnerl, Victims Counselor and Desk Officer for International Relations at the Domestic Abuse Intervention Center in Vienna, and Maria Rösslhumer, Director of the Association of Austrian Autonomous Women's Shelters, will be presenting the topic. We would like to thank you for taking the time and joining us today, and we hope that the session today can be mutually beneficial and can support your work through knowledge sharing and reflection. As you can see from your screen, the session is titled Providing NGO Information to GREVIO and Writing a Shadow Report. We are planning to run the session from 13 o'clock to 14 o'clock. Depending on the time we spend answering questions and listening to audience input, we may end sooner than 14 o'clock. I would like to go through some technical aspects of this webinar. As you may be aware, as a participant joining the webinar, you are automatically muted. We will keep the muting on until the end of the presentation and beginning of questions and comments part of the webinar. Additionally, we cannot see you even if you have your webcam on. In case something does not work, close out of the webinar and log in again by clicking the link in your registration confirmation email. And for your information, the webinar is being recorded. Taking part in the webinar is relatively simple and hopefully enjoyable. First, have a listen to the presentation of the topic to prepare for subsequent discussion. Then, during presentation of the topic, if any question arises, please write any questions to the facilitators in the questions pane. Facilitators will answer the questions at the end when we start the questions discussion part of the webinar. During the questions and discussion, I am not able to unmute everyone so that we can have a lively chat. I can only unmute individual participants. So please raise your electronic hand for the facilitator to invite your question or contribution to the discussion. And last, but never the least, enjoy. I will now hand over the leadership of the webinar to Maria Rösslhumer, who will go over the agenda of the webinar before she begins.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I want to inform you about the agenda through this meeting. You can see on this agenda that I start with the information about the coordination of the shadow report in Austria. And the next part, I will inform you about the country visit from the GREVIO meeting and the national meetings in Austria. National lobbying in Austria. And then my colleague, Kerstin Schinnerl, she will inform you about the structure of the shadow report and the executive summary, and also about the challenges with the recommendation for writing a shadow report. And in the end, you have the possibility to come with questions, and you can make comments on your presentation. Okay, let's start. It's here. Okay, yes, we will inform you in general about our experiences in writing a shadow report and based on our experiences in Austria. First of all, you know that in the state was obliged to write a state report, and in Austria, the Austrian coordinating body was the Ministry for Health and Women's Affairs, and they also have asked the NGOs to answer questions for the state report. This means they ask us to answer some questions from the questionnaire, because the state report had a clear questionnaires, which you also can find on the website of the European Council of Europe website. And some of the NGO have done it and answered to the state reports, but not all the NGOs has done this, has followed this requirement. Okay, and now I want to inform you about the preparation of the NGO Shadow Report, which were coordinated by the Austrian Women's Shelter Network and the Domestic Abuse Intervention Centers. This means Kerstin Schinnerl and I, we were responsible for writing this NGO Shadow Report. Yes, regarding the duration, we had really a very short time. We had only time for writing this shadow report only 4 months, including the summer holidays. This means we had time from April to September 2016. And we submitted the report to the Council of Europe at 19th of September. Yeah, and we first of all, before we started to ask our relevant NGOs, we collected all the email addresses from the most relevant NGOs who work in the field of domestic violence, violence against women and children. This was more or less the women's shelters in Austria, the intervention centers, the women's centers, and also the networks of women's centers and counseling centers, and the centers for sexual violence. And we also considered who are the most relevant target groups, and this was the Association for Migrants, Asylum Seekers, and for Women with Disabilities, and all LGBT and children organizations. All these organizations be involved in our platform. And afterwards, we have prepared an invitation letter for all these NGOs, and we have sent it out, this letter, at the beginning of May for the first meeting. And in total, we had 3 meetings with the NGOs who were interested in this shadow report and who has had time for coming from the countryside of Austria. Most of them were from Vienna, of course, because of the local situation. Okay, the next slide is about coordination of the NGO Shadow Report. During this time, these 4 months, we decided, or we divided the responsibilities between the organizations, and we tried to consider who can write which chapter and which articles of this report, and we also organized we planned timetables for sending materials and for the most relevant content for the articles in this during this time. And of course, we wrote minutes, and we informed all our NGOs about the we informed them regularly about the current information, the current situation. And afterwards, when we were more or less finished with organizing and with our meetings, in the end we decide about the structure. How should we write the report? Shall we follow more the questionnaires, or shall we fill out the articles? In the end, we decided to fill out the articles, and we followed each articles of the Istanbul Convention. And at least, or finally, we wrote the NGO shadow report during 2 weeks, in August to September, and we submitted the report at 19th of September. But before we have sent the NGO report, shadow report, to the Council of Europe, to the GREVIO committee, we have also asked for feedbacks from the NGOs. This means that they had the possibility to give us feedbacks. Is everything correct what we have written down, and is everything or do they have comments on our report, and so on. And then we also ask the coordinating body, this means the Austrian, the Ministry for Austrian, the Austrian Ministry for Health and Women. We have asked also them about to send us the state report, and they have done it, which was good for us. Okay, here you can see this comprehensive coalition of NGOs in Austria. We had 30 members of the coalition were involved in our NGO schedule report. This organization, African Women's Organization, Asylum Seekers Coordination, and also migrant organizations or networks of women's NGOs, or all the centers who are working with women with disabilities, and so on. Okay, and afterwards, when we have sent the shadow report to the GREVIO committee, they ask us to send them, or preparing a list and names of different organizations for the GREVIO visit. As you know, the GREVIO committee will also visit your country after the writing the shadow report, and they they are planning visits with the states and also visits with the NGOs. And in Austria, they asked us also to prepare the visits for them, and we had in total 5 NGO meetings between 28th and 2nd of December. And we had these 5 separate meetings with the members of the coalition. This means the members of the NGO coalitions, and the lawyers, migrant organizations, members of the health sector, and organization for children. And we also organized for them the venue, the meeting rooms, and also the catering. And afterwards, we tried to make lobbying and promotion the schedule report. And for this, we organized meetings with the members of the coalitions, and we have done a lot more. This means we try to find out what is the best way to promote the schedule report, and how can we establish a coalition for lobbying the report. This is also still an ongoing process, because we have done it in several meetings, and now we are also in the duration to find a good adequate name for the coalition, and we try to create a campaign, a media and social media campaign for promoting the recommendation for the Istanbul Convention. And yes, and for example, one of the slogans is investing more money in prevention work, save money, save lives. Yes, these are just example. And now we are informed about the shadow report, the NGO, no, the state report will come at 27th of September. We will expect it, this report from the Council of Europe. And at the moment we also organize a press conference in Austria for promoting and for dissemination the results of this report. Yes, these are more or less the most important information from my side. And afterwards, you can, if you have any more questions to me, I can answer it in the end of this meeting. Now I give over the floor to my colleague, Kerstin Schinnerl. She will inform you about the structure.
Okay, thank you, Maria. Hi, everyone. As Maria already mentioned, I will talk about the structure of the Austrian NGO report itself. So, as you might have noticed, and also as Maria has already mentioned, we decided for the structure of the NGO shadow report to follow the structure of the Istanbul Convention itself, which means that we decided to go through the Istanbul Convention article by article, not following the questionnaire that was sent out to the states and that we originally considered using as a guideline for our NGO shadow report, but it proved to be just very misleading, which I will talk about a little bit later. So we ended up using the structure of the Istanbul Convention itself. And within the sections relating to each article of the Istanbul Convention, we had subsections on background, challenges, and recommendations. The only exception from this structure is a special focus that we decided to have on children. We decided to have that special focus and pull together two separate articles in the convention that both talk about children, because we wanted to emphasize the thematic issue, because we found that children in Austria are really the forgotten victims in our system of support for violence victims, and that's why we created a special section on this thematic issue, breaking through the normal structure that we decided to follow. At the beginning and at the end of the report, there's an introduction and appendices, respectively. In the introduction, we decided to just give general information about indicators of gender equality in Austria, like the gender pay gap, the political participation of women, and access to abortion, and other relevant issues that are not specifically related to violence against women, but of course also indicate the situation of women in Austria generally. In the appendices, we included available statistics on criminal offenses and the attrition and conviction rate, for example, and also an article explaining how police emergency barring orders work in Austria, for example, just for more in-depth information for the GREVIO committee. Some of the appendices were also in German, since we assumed that if the committee was interested in them, they could have them translated or have a German-speaking person help them with the appendices. So I will now go into more detail of our sections relating to each article of the convention. In the background section, we tried to relate the issue we wanted to bring up to the text of the convention logically. We tried to keep this section very short, as we assumed that the state report would already cover most of what we had to say in this section, because the state report, of course, gives an overview of what the state has done to tackle the respective issue, and it will, of course, underline things that have been done already and that are working well, and will be quite descriptive. But what we wanted to do with our NGO shadow report was to emphasize what was not working and where the shortcomings were in the implementation of the convention by the Austrian state. So this is what we talked about in the challenges section. We tried to sum up what the challenges and shortcomings from our perspective were. And then in the recommendation sections, we tried to give concrete recommendations how to improve the situation in the specific Austrian context. We were hoping that the more concrete and specific we would formulate the recommendations, the more useful it would be for national lobbying purposes, but also maybe we could get the GREVIO committee to pick up some of our recommendations and use them in their recommendations to the state directly. So I will give you an example of one of the articles that we talked about in the NGO report. It's Article 8 relating to financial resources. The text of the convention is parties shall allocate appropriate financial and human resources for the adequate implementation of integrated policies, measures and programs to prevent and combat all forms of violence covered by the scope of this convention, including those carried out by non-governmental organizations and civil society. So what we did in the background section was that we said, the Istanbul Convention establishes that appropriate financial resources need to be allocated. And we're drawing a conclusion from this, saying this means that state authorities need to establish what amount is needed for the prevention of violence against women. Then in the challenges section, we lay out that in 2011, there was an EU study estimating that the total cost of gender-based violence within the EU was 228 billion euros per year, which means that that would be 450 euros per citizen per year in the EU. Now, there's little information on how much money is currently being invested into the protection of violence against women in Austria. What we do know is that the annual budget of the Federal Ministry for Health and Women's Affairs is only 10 million euros. And this budget is supposed to be used for the prevention of violence against women and gender equality measures. So in our recommendations section on Article 8, we did a little calculation. We repeated that violence costs 450 euros per citizen per year within the EU, according to a recent EU study. And then we argued that at least 10% of these costs should be invested in the prevention of violence. Then we tried to preempt the counter argument that probably 450 euros was way too high of an estimation. So we said, let's assume this number is too high and let's cut it to 250 euros per citizen per year. If you divide that by 10 to make 10%, this would make 25 euros per Austrian citizen that should be spent on the prevention of violence. If you multiply it by the inhabitants living in Austria, that would mean that 210 million euros should be spent in the prevention of gender-based violence. But as we've heard before, the annual budget of the Women's Ministry is only 10 million, and that's not only for the prevention of violence, but also for general gender equality measures. So our main recommendation was that we demand that the budget of the Women's Ministry be increased to at least 210 million euros. And in addition, there should be adequate funding also for all other ministries to work on issues of violence protection, and also on the provincial level, because Austria is a federal state and we need to demand money not only on the federal level, but also on the provincial level to make sure all measures of violence protection are funded. I will now talk about the executive summary that we prepared after we had submitted the report to the GREVIO committee. Ideally, I would say an executive summary should already be contained in the NGO report itself. But as you know, we were the first NGO coalition ever to submit a shadow report to GREVIO. So we were pretty much figuring things out while we did them. So after we had submitted the report, we realized that a summary would be useful both for national lobbying, but also to emphasize which were the key priorities for our NGO coalition. And we managed to prepare the executive summary at least before the state dialogue took place. This was approximately 2 months after the state report had been submitted. So around that time, a state delegation was invited to the GREVIO committee, and the committee was asking them detailed questions, additional questions that hadn't been answered by the state report. So the idea was for us to have this executive summary sent to the GREVIO committee before they did the state report. So ideally, they could pick up some of the key priorities we were talking about in the executive summary and address questions to the state in the state dialogue relating specifically to the key priorities we had lined out. Okay, so at the end of my presentation, I'm going to talk about challenges we as an NGO coalition faced with writing the report, and I will also give some recommendations for other NGOs in other countries for writing future NGO shadow reports. I hope it will get easier now that there's some shadow reports out there already that new NGO coalitions can use as a guideline. So as I mentioned before, concerning the structure of our report, we were very much guided by the questionnaire that was sent to the state at the beginning. And I would say that this was just very misleading and confusing, because in the beginning we had a very different structure of the report following those questions, but the questions don't even address every article of the convention, and also the questions are addressed to the states. So the questions sometimes ask for information that NGOs cannot possibly provide, and also it just makes it easier to answer the questions. Okay, let me rephrase. We were kind of tempted to answer the questions in a very descriptive way, which is what is being done in the state report, but it's exactly what we're not aiming for in the NGO report. So I think if NGOs follow the questionnaire, they will be more likely to end up being very descriptive in their report also. So I would really recommend to let go of the questionnaire and focus on the articles of the convention itself, which is already a recommendation that I will talk about on the next slide. Another challenge was, as Maria said before, the lack of resources. This means lack of financial resources and time resources. Of course, there's no extra budget provided to NGOs to do this very complex additional work. And also the timing was specifically challenging for Austria because the first evaluation period was during the summer months. We had April to end of August to work on our NGO report, and as you all know, it's harder to get work done during the summer months when everyone is on holidays. As I said before, the contributions we received from NGOs participating in the report were often quite descriptive and not focusing on the challenges and what was missing in Austria. So I felt like it was sometimes hard to convey to participating NGOs that the emphasis should really be on shortcomings and not on describing how everything was being implemented already, because that's what the state report does already. And yes, of course, we were under a lot of pressure, or at least that's what it felt like to us, because it was the first shadow report ever to be submitted to GREVIO, and also we were ambitious enough to aspire to have a really good shadow report that could be used as a benchmark for future shadow reports and a model, ideally. So the recommendations I would have for other NGO coalitions in the future are relating to the structure and the content of the report. Do not follow the questionnaire, I've mentioned that already. Study the explanatory report that has been published with the Istanbul Convention. I found it to be very useful to understand the underlying ideas behind each article, and more detailed information about what the text of the convention wanted to create as obligations for the state. Another useful recommendation, I think, is to relate to the principle of due diligence also in other sections of the NGO report. So there is Article 5 in the convention talking about the principle of due diligence, which means that states do not only have to refrain from committing breaches to the convention, but they also have positive obligations to, to prevent, investigate, and punish acts of violence perpetrated by non-state actors. So this really is the core principle that you can relate to when demanding positive action by the state, because according to this principle of due diligence, the state needs to do more than just not commit human rights abuses themselves. They need to guarantee that people, women in specific, are protected from non-state actors committing human rights abuses too. So we try to reference the principle of due diligence in many other sections that focused on specific issues of the convention too. And concerning the procedural and strategic aspects of writing an NGO report, we found it useful to have one person at the end to put contributions written by other NGOs together and to edit them. So realistically, the contributions by other NGOs won't always be perfect when you receive them. They might only be buzzwords. They might not be written in very good English. They might not be written in English at all, but in your national language. So having one person to create a coherent report at the end and edit it would definitely be useful. And also, as Maria said before, we did that work pretty much within the last 2 weeks of our writing process, and I would not recommend anyone else to do that under so much pressure, because as you can imagine, it's a big piece of work to do that, and it would just be better to have at least 1 month and have enough time to also send the edited version back to everyone who has been contributing for comments and amendments, and then go through it again. Which also already brings me to my next recommendation, which is to start early. Our NGO coalition was only formed after the GREVIO Secretariat contacted us with an email in early April. But of course, the evaluation schedules of GREVIO are published long in advance and can be seen online. So if you want to make sure that you have enough time for the forming of your coalition and the actual writing process, it would be useful to think ahead of time, check when your country is due to be evaluated, and then start forming the coalition before you get a notification by the GREVIO Secretariat. You don't have to wait for that. And my last recommendation would be to prepare a summary of the full report, as we did with the executive summary. As I said, we only sent that after the full report was submitted. Ideally, it should be included already, I think, but as long as GREVIO can receive it before the state dialogue, I think it's still very useful. And the added value is that you can use it for national lobbying, at least if your report is as long as Austria's report was, which is around 90 pages. And we knew, of course, that in terms of national lobbying, that would be way too long because no one will read it. So it's useful to have a shorter executive summary. Okay, this was the end of my presentation. We will now open up the discussion and questions and comments section.
Okay, firstly, I would like to thank Kerstin and Maria for coming to the WAVE office to do this webinar. Let's begin with our question and discussion part now. We will start by answering questions that have been written in the questions pane. It looks like nobody has asked any questions yet, which means we're going to go ahead and move on to see if anybody has raised their electronic hand. Oh, wait, I see one. I see Aurela Bozo. I'm going to unmute you and let you ask a question. Aurela, are you there?
Yes, I am here. I work for CFCI, and I'm interested to know something more about the way of functioning of the platform, the tools you use to make this platform functional. It was a traditional way of communication via email, etc., or you use some new ways?
It's more traditional way, no? Do you want to
an electronic platform, asking online questions, giving answers, or how did it function?
Yeah, okay, we understand. Okay, let me be honest. It was quite chaotic at the beginning, and we definitely didn't use any very innovative strategy to coordinate between us. We had regular coordination meetings, as Maria said. So we met in person, which was, of course, a little challenging for NGOs not based in the capital. That's always a challenge. And apart from that, we just used emails to communicate amongst each other. And we had Maria and me as the main responsible coordinators, and assigned one responsible person for each chapter of the NGO report. So we had kind of a hierarchy of people responsible for coordinating each chapter, and then people reporting on different articles within the chapter. And then the people coordinating the chapters would report to Maria and me. That was the idea. In practice, it was a little less coordinated, really.
Because it was summertime too.
Okay, let's move on to another question, hopefully. Let's see. So we have here Natalia Vilku. Natalia, I have unmuted you. Are you here?
Yes, I'm here. Hello.
Hello.
I'm representing the Women's Law Center from Moldova.
Hello.
And hello. I'm the only question I have, whether I'm actually interested in this cooperation you had among the NGOs as well. And because this is, I understand it's a real challenge to get a very good cooperation between all of them. But I'm really interested in still how many NGOs practically contributed to the shadow report. 1, 2, 3, or 20, if you know this figure, because usually it happens that 1 or 2 NGOs are really working hard on a certain report, and then the coalition presents the result.
Yeah, it's true that this was kind of what happened with our report too. I mean, it was clearly the coordinators who put in the most practical work to compile this report. We did get some contributions from different NGOs, but let's say the level of the contributions was varied a lot. Sometimes it was just really buzzwords, a couple of sentences in German about what the respective NGO considered particularly important within their field of expertise. And with some of the NGOs, we did actually receive a coherent, fully written contribution that followed the structure of the report with background, challenges, recommendations already. So I would say out of the platform of 30 NGOs, maybe 15 gave some kind of contribution, but only 5 had a really substantive contribution that was at the high level of being finished already when they sent it.
Thank you so much. That's what I wanted to know.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm
So
trying
you
to
must just be frustrated if you do not get so much support in writing them, but this is reality.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Thank
You're
you.
welcome, Sari.
So it looks like the next person to raise her hand is Sally. Sally, you are unmuted. Are you there?
Hello. Yes,
Hello.
greetings from Finland.
Hi.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hi. Greetings from Finland, and thank you for the very informative webinar. My question is about the length of the report, which you did, and in connection to that, did you have difficulties in prioritizing which themes you get in?
I think since we decided from the very beginning that we would try to report on each and every article of the convention, it wasn't really a challenge to prioritize at the beginning. The issue came up when we were doing the executive summary, of course. But by that time, it was easier already because we had reported on every article already. So drawing from that baseline, I think it was more, it was easier to decide which areas we wanted to emphasize for the executive summary. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and in this coalition, did you have easy to find agreements on what is not working, which are the recommendation you want to give, or did you have to discuss very much about what kind of, or what point of view you will write down to the report?
No, we didn't have to discuss that much because our situation really was that everyone was really happy that someone had taken over the task of coordinating and writing the report, more or less. So they were happy to just give some input at the end when we sent the more or less finished report out for comments. And then they still had a chance to give some feedback. But before that, there was really not much discussion or arguments going on what to emphasize. That's, of course, the advantage of having two people work really hard and everyone being grateful for not having to do it.
Okay. Yes, thank you for the answer.
But now I think everybody or all our partners in the coalition, they are really happy that we have this report, and they are not, there was no criticisms on this report. I think everybody is really happy that we have done this work.
Great. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions, Ali. Let's see. It looks like we have gotten, although
Yeah.
I think there's a new one. There's a new question from Letizia. Letizia, are you here? Do you have a question? Sometimes there's accidental hand raisings which happen. I'm going to go ahead and put it back on. Okay. It looks like we have answered all of the questions. Yes. So I would like to just thank Kerstin and Maria for taking their time to discuss the GREVIO report with everybody. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. And thank you to the participants for your time and for sharing your experiences of the discussion. We hope that the exchange of information was helpful for your work as well.
And thank you so much, Alina, for preparing this webinar.
No problem. I will be sending out a Dropbox link with a folder containing the edited video of the webinar, as well as a presentation and some other useful documents that we think could help you with the GREVIO report. I wish you a wonderful day, and we will now sign off.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Bye.